here. I'm Richard Pattle, and I'm based here in Bengaluru in South India, and I'm delighted today that we're joined by Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary for India. My current role has me not only as Senior Advisor to Zerodha, which is one of the tech unicorns based out of Bangalore, now India's largest stockbroking platform, but also True Beacon, a new platform for ultra high net worth and high net worth families globally who want to invest into India. Today's webinar is really the first in a series where we're interviewing prominent individuals who've held very senior roles, perhaps in business, in diplomacy, in politics, as philanthropists, or as entrepreneurs. And Nirupama, I know you're just a couple of miles away from me here in Bangalore, but we're really delighted to welcome you today for this interactive session over the next 40 minutes or so. Nirupama has, I think it's fair to say, had a very distinguished, lengthy and incredibly successful career, 40 years or so in diplomacy, ultimately running the Indian Foreign Service, but starting off with a range of postings that she'll tell us a little more about in a moment, before notable positions, not only as the ambassador for India to the United States of America, but also India's first female ambassador to China, and India's first and only spokesperson for the Ministry of External Affairs. And can you believe it, also only the second woman to hold the ministerial post of Foreign Secretary here in India. So Nirupama, thank you once again for joining us. But I've hardly done you justice because you've had an extraordinary career globally and still very active. We'll come on to that in a moment. But I wonder if you can spend a couple of minutes just outlining your career and really gives those who are joining us a view and insight into the breadth and depth that you have to go into in the Foreign Service here in India and globally.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have this opportunity to be speaking with you this evening in the time of Corona from Bangalore. And as you said, we're just a few miles apart, but because of social distancing and all the regulations in place, we've had to do the interview in this fashion, but I'm sure it'll go ahead just fine. You asked me about my career in the Foreign Service, and let me at the outset say that it was my dream as a young girl to be a diplomat, and I dreamt of a career in diplomacy, in being an ambassador ultimately, but in representing my country abroad, and essentially being able to meet with interesting people and to have a ringside view of history. Although when you're young, you really don't factor in all these issues, and you're essentially a romantic at heart, an idealist at heart, and you look at the Foreign Service as a goal that you want to somehow achieve. So I took the examination soon after I finished my Master of Arts degree in English Literature in 1972. I was all of 21 years old, and I was able to pass the examination and qualify for the Foreign Service in the first attempt. Because you're allowed up to 3 attempts in my time to take the examination and qualify, but I was fortunate enough to make it in the first try. And I went to Vienna on my first posting.
And if I may, Nirupama, just to interrupt for a millisecond, that gives you an illustration of your modesty. You didn't just pass at your first try. I think that I'm right in saying that you were the highest scoring candidate out of the hundreds of thousands of people across India who sit that examination for the civil service.
Yes, I did. I was what they call an all India topper. That's the Indian way of putting it. Yes, I did. And I took the exam and went to Mussoorie. That's where we had our training academy. And I didn't know anybody in my class, as it were, in the batch, as we call it, because I came from a small town, essentially a small town girl. I didn't come from one of the big metropolitan centers like Delhi and Madras in those days. Today it's Chennai, Mumbai, or Kolkata. I came from a small town called Aurangabad. It's a big city today, but it was a small town in those days. So it was quite a transition going from, a semi-rural place to to the lights of Delhi, as it were, and to all the glamour of being a part of the government of India. That's at least how I looked at it. As it turns out, once you're in your career and profession, once you're in the hurly-burly of it, of course, things are very different. You're in the trenches and you're working hard.
And just take us through those lots of chapters, some of which were as short as 2 years throughout the 40 years of public service.
Yes, I went to Vienna on my first posting. Vienna, city of dreams, city of music. I went there to study German, and it was a lovely introduction to the world of diplomacy. You know, we've all heard of the Congress of Vienna, we've heard of Metternich. The way a world order was literally shaped by that Congress of 1815. So I was there in a very historical place, and it was a wonderful initiation, a rite of initiation into the world of diplomacy. And I came back from Vienna, worked in the Ministry of External Affairs in the Foreign Office for a few years. I worked on issues related to Africa. Those were the days of apartheid in South Africa, and India was one of the leading countries battling racial discrimination. It was an issue about which we were very concerned from outset, from the days of our independence. So I was happy to be working on that. And then I had the opportunity to do one of the neighboring country relationships. I worked on Nepal, which was enormously exciting. And from there, I went on a posting to Sri Lanka, another neighboring country. And there, you know, the diversity of issues and matters that you look at in the Foreign Service, I think, is what makes it so attractive as a profession. I handled issues relating to plantation labor in Sri Lanka. We had a lot of plantation laborers who were originally from India and who were stateless. So I was introduced to the specter, to the tragedy of statelessness, of migration, of refugees, of repatriation in my work in Sri Lanka. So that was the kind of, you know, diversity of backgrounds and challenges that you faced in your work. And from Sri Lanka, I had the opportunity to come back to Delhi and start working on China and on issues concerning our boundary with China, a very still unresolved issue, but something that required a deep dive in terms of immersion. It took a while for me to get acquainted with all the intricacies of the issue, but I was very, very interested in the subject. I was really drawn to it, issues of frontiers, issues of borders, the issue of Tibet, the very complex nature of our relations with China. So I kind of built a reputation as a specialist in border affairs between India and China. And that's, I spent a very fruitful 8 years looking at the subject. I was a member of the delegation that the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi took to China. He was an Indian Prime Minister, was making a very historic visit to China after an interval of about 34 years. We had such a hiatus in terms of leadership level dialogue, in terms of political initiatives between the two countries, and to be able to be present during the making of history, as it were, I think I felt enormously privileged to be there at that time. And then I went to the United States, did a short posting there. I handled media and communication affairs at our embassy in Washington, and then went on to Latin America, to Peru, the other America, as it were, as our ambassador there. That was my first ambassadorial assignment. I was present at the Japanese embassy in Peru in the December of 1995, when the embassy, the entire guests, the whole guest list at the Japanese ambassador's reception to celebrate the emperor's birthday was taken hostage by a group of terrorists. I just happened to leave the embassy a couple of minutes before that. I had to go to another engagement, so I was mercifully saved from that experience. But you know, again, talking of diversity, talking of difference, talking of, you know, the kind of challenges you face in the course of your work. And here it was a full-blown terrorist attack which took 4 months to resolve. And again, one was there in Peru at that time. And from Peru, I went to Russia. This was Yeltsin's Russia. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Russia was a much attenuated power. The Cold War had come to an end. People were talking about the end of history. The United States had emerged as a hyperpower, as it were. So there I was in Russia. And when I came back to Delhi, I became the first woman spokesperson of the foreign ministry. And it was at the time of 9/11. So I was witness to all that happened there. I remember the trips we made to New York, to Washington, to Paris and London in the wake of 9/11 with our foreign minister, and to be able to just be witness to the enormous life change, as it were, that had occurred as a result of those horrendous attacks on the Twin Towers, and the way the world changed as a result of that. So this is just to briefly illustrate the kind of work that I did before I went to Sri Lanka as High Commissioner in 2004.
And then, of course, particularly we'll come on to this later, ambassadorial roles in the US, in China, and ultimately.
Yes, and I'd like to say in Sri Lanka, there's no sleep for the wicked, as it were, because I was there when the tsunami happened. And that was, again, a life-changing event for the people of Sri Lanka, for the people of South India, people who were affected, the people of Indonesia, the Indian Ocean tsunami. And just to see the death, the destruction, the enormous suffering wrought by that disaster, which was entirely natural. 9/11 was a man-made disaster, but this was an act of terrorism, and this was a natural disaster. And I don't believe I will ever experience that again in my lifetime. For that matter, it comes like once in a few generations, an event of that nature. So there I was during the tsunami in Sri Lanka, and during the last days of the civil war also, in a time of a civil war that had gone on for almost 3 decades. And there also, in the midst of great violence and death and so many assassinations, a lot of violence that went on around oneself.
And we'll come back to your postings in the US and China a little later on, but also just to finish off this section on your leadership career, give us an idea of the scale of the operation here in India for the Foreign Service, and indeed everyone that you had under your chain of command when you were Foreign Secretary.
Yes. First of all, let me say the Foreign Secretary is not a political appointment. It's a career appointment. You're the head of the Foreign Service. So you're the senior most diplomat of the country. So it's the equivalent of, let me say, a vice foreign minister, not a foreign minister in the political sense. You head the civil service, you head the diplomatic service of the country. So it's a career appointment, not a political appointment. So the Foreign Service of India is a relatively small foreign service when you look at the size of the country, when you look at our enormous proportions, when you look at our population, you look at the nature of our democracy. It's a fairly modest size foreign service. We're taking in more people. We have done that in the last few years, but when you compare it with the Foreign Service of the United States or Brazil or the UK for that matter, or any other of the important leaders on the global stage, it is a small foreign service, although I would definitely vouch for the quality of our diplomats. They're all recruited, as we just spoke, through a very competitive civil service examination. So their quality of the officer cannot be denied. And they all work very hard. I think they work extremely hard. They take on a great deal of burden, and they're able to switch between different assignments. They become experts in different fields. And therefore, I think we have a foreign service that we can be very proud of.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, listen, we've got some questions coming on, particularly for geopolitics, for those who are joining us on the webinar. But again, leadership, the very obvious question, I'm sure you are a mentor to many young people who go into careers, not necessarily just in government or the civil service, but also on a wider remit as well. What sort of advice do you give young women in particular who, like you, in many cases, are having to forge a new path, sometimes in a man's world, and how do you tell them to grapple with the sort of challenges that you must have faced as a young woman entering a male-dominated profession?
I think the world was very different, Richard, in the time that I entered the Foreign Service. Things are extremely different today. So I cannot really tell young women that everything that they are faced with is the same as that which I experienced when I entered the Foreign Service. But I'd say this much, that it still is very much a man's world, especially in developing countries such as ours. And women have to not only be completely convinced and confident about their goals and what they want to achieve. And that's the first lesson that I can teach based on my own experience. I wanted to be in the Foreign Service, and I wasn't going to be deterred by any doubting Thomases who would tell me, you know, it's not going to be easy, and you know, it's things are going to be very difficult for women. They were difficult for women. Married women, for instance, were not allowed to enter the diplomatic service in my time, the Indian Foreign Service. And I think that was the case in many foreign service all over the world. I reviewed a book on diplomacy in the Western world a few years ago, a diplomacy as it concerns women. And I found that the experiences, the life experiences, were very similar for women who were not Indian either. But today, the numbers of women in diplomacy have grown significantly. Even the numbers in our foreign service, I think, are close to about 20 to 22% now of the total cohort, which is a big advancement, a huge progress on what it was in my time. But I think as women, you have to strive to do your best wherever you are. You have to be better than the best, and you can never let that rest, as my mother would always say. And I think you should not be deterred really by the surround sound that sometimes hits you, you know, from audiences that you may encounter, or you know what public opinion may have to say about women. You should not be deterred by that. Focus very clearly on your aim and give it all you've got. I mean, that may sound very simple, but I can assure you that it's extremely tough and can be quite complex.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, listen, I want to move on now to communications and global comms, strategic comms, in an increasingly digitized world, of course, where many politicians have either deliberately or otherwise sought to disintermediate the government organs, the press officers, the media outlets, the spokesmen and women, and appeal directly to the voters, the electorate. And that's not just here in India, it's around the world, notably in the US perhaps. Give us an idea of how the landscape has changed during your career, which is very, very considerable, but also your thoughts on some of the unintended consequences that may flow from this direct linkage between political leaders and the electorates globally.
Well, I know that social media particularly has become the darling of the political class today, and you know, we can't deny these unassailable facts. But when it comes to professionals, civil servants, diplomats, I think you have to embrace the technology without being technocratic, because you don't want technocracy to replace bureaucracy, really. You have to be able to work with technology. You have to embrace the new medium. And you have to be able, again, as I said earlier, to speak with conviction, with coherence, and with confidence. Because the public is looking in an era of false news or alternative news for the facts, for the truth. And if you can establish yourself as a figure in this very, very motley crowd of people who are addressing global audiences, if you can be that voice that is clear, that is comprehensible, and that is truthful, I think you can establish a niche for yourself and a position for yourself. And I think that is what we need to do as diplomats and as civil servants today, because we are working in the trenches and the public is desperately looking for answers. It's looking for the factual position on a given issue. And if you're able to communicate that without fear or favor, I think you will have done your job more than 100%.
And what about the issue of neutrality? Because that is a civil servant's challenge wherever they are in the world. And you've been in some of the postings where you've had huge crises. You've obviously served for a variety of different governments here, of different flavors and persuasions and so on. How has that been as a personal challenge, and indeed, more importantly, probably for those men and women who have been working for you across your ministry during your career?
Well, the first and most important thing, I think, is to be fearless in some senses. Because I remember almost 10 years ago when Twitter was still a very new medium, and nobody in the government, at least at the official level, the government of India, had really acquired a Twitter account at the senior level, that is. I decided to join Twitter and to reach out to Indians who were stranded in Libya at the time, as you know, of the invasion of Libya, just before the fall of Gaddafi. We had a lot of Indians stranded in Libya, and the only way to reach out to them when all other communication had broken down was through social media, through Twitter. And that's how I was initiated into the world of social media, as it were. And I found that became a kind of a precedent. I wouldn't say it was an example. I don't want to presume too much, but it became a kind of a precedent, a kind of a trendsetter for future situations and occasions when diplomats and officials needed to reach out to populations, especially Indians, in various parts of the world. And then it was an opportunity to be able to state policy, to be able to answer questions, to be able to clear the fog, as it were, of doubt or ignorance or prejudice or stereotypes that attach themselves to certain issues. So I started out with a certain leap of faith, as it were, but a belief and a sense of conviction that I was doing the right thing. We all make mistakes. I'm not saying one hasn't, made mistakes, but I found in retrospect that this was the right thing to have done. And today, who questions the use of Twitter by officialdom, not just by politicians, as a means of informing, of educating, and of reassuring?
And perhaps as leaders have become more au fait and more confident with the use of Twitter and other social media channels, they're also perhaps undercutting the policy-making organs within their governments, because they're expressing foreign policy, sometimes taking their own diplomats by surprise. Is that a huge issue now for those who have replaced you in those government departments?
Well, I suppose, especially if you have the media and you have 24/7 television and you have all the Twitter accounts that are blazing away 24/7, I presume the challenge that you face is quite enormous. But that only calls for perhaps a very activist approach to the use of this new medium. You have to be consistent, you have to be regular, and you have to be able to lend your voice so that you rise above the cacophony, as it were. And people are able to sift through this noise to be able to zone in, to reach exactly where you're speaking from and what you're speaking about to them. So I think the challenges are much greater, to ask your question. I think you have to be far more active. You have to abandon your ivory tower literally, this is, somebody said, it's gum boot diplomacy today.
Very good. Well, listen, I want to now change tack to obviously bring us up to speed with what's going on here in India and internationally, and come on to the third area for discussion, which is really around COVID-19 and obviously the implications for huge geopolitical relations and so on. But before I do, I want to get your views, if I may, on how effective to date the lockdown has been here in India. I have to confess it's been very effective for me, stuck here in a hotel with just one other guest for company. Not the worst prison in the world. But on a more serious note, this lockdown was announced with about 3.5 hours notice. Much of the country, migrant worker population was in the initial stages stranded. As we speak today, the doubling rate of the virus is, I think, around 10 or 11 days here in India, which compares very favorably, if those statistics are right, with some economies in the West who perhaps are doubling every 2 to 3 days. What's your view on how widespread the virus may be here in India, and indeed whether the lockdown has been a major contributory factor to that, or are there perhaps wider factors at play?
Well, I think the lockdown has been very effective. You just, you're there, locked down for the last, what shall I say, 6 to 7 weeks, as it were. Here I am in my apartment in Bangalore. I think for people like us, it's been relatively easy to adjust to. But in countries such as ours, especially given the very short notice that was given for the lockdown, just a couple of hours, I think the major proportion of people who have been affected are those who are migrant labor, or people who work in the informal sector, people who depend on daily wages or weekly wages, people who live far away from their villages. And that's what you've seen played out in the last few weeks, as hundreds and thousands of people have had to trudge home many hundreds of kilometers. And that, has reminded me in some ways of scenes from The Grapes of Wrath, from Steinbeck's novel about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s America. But it has been an enormous unfolding of human suffering as far as these people are concerned. But yes, the lockdown has helped in checking the spread of the virus, especially for a country like India, which over the years since independence has not spent enough on public health facilities. I think the proportion of spending as a segment of our public expenditure on health has been just about 1% of GDP. I think many development economists have for decades said we need to spend much more. And I hope as a result of what we've seen unfolding in the last few weeks and what COVID-19 is going to teach us once all this is over, is that we need to revamp our public health systems. We need to spend more on social indicators, on human development, on education, on public health. And we need to look out for the lesser privileged, the disadvantaged sections of our society. In India, I believe we should be devoting much more attention and much more of our resources to these segments of our population.
Thank you for that. Well, I want to really bring in both China and the US. And of course, you commentate for the media and write extensively as well on this subject. But I think that in common with many, you've commented about globalization, the fact that it's left behind billions of people around the world. And that was a problem for major world economies and populations long before COVID-19 hoved into view. That has really presumably accelerated the issues that globalization and many people have benefited hugely from globalization, but particularly here in India, I think it's fair to say that perhaps hundreds of millions of people have been left behind by it. How do you think COVID-19 in particular will redefine globalization as a theory, and what are the risks and dangers to countries such as India?
Well, on the contrary, I think globalization did a lot of good for India. because if you look at the numbers of people lifted out of poverty, about 140 million people just in the span of about 5 years between 2008 and 2013, 2014, huge numbers of people lifted out of poverty. The economy opened up, a lot of foreign investment, new technologies, better connectivity, infrastructure building, all that changed the face of India. So globalization did a lot of good for us in terms of our ability to reach out to the world and for the world to reach out to us. But globalization, the downside of globalization all over the world, you've seen this, is also that it has unleashed a lot of inequality. Some people have become very rich. Yes, a lot of people have been lifted out of poverty, but rising expectations of these people being lifted out of poverty are still to be met. And it has also, I think, kind of seen the rise of nativism, of populism, of autocracy in many parts of the world. So the democratic dividend, how much has globalization helped the democratic dividend in all our countries? One has to ask these questions. And that is where I think people now speak about a backlash against globalization. So we'll have to see at the end of COVID-19, once the pandemic is behind us, what the world is going to look like. Globalization had already unleashed a lot of discontent, as we've seen all over the world. Look at what has happened in the United States. The rise of China, the competition between the US and China, who knows where that will lead. There's a world order, shall we say, which is quite entropic today. And who is going to lead this new order? I think it calls upon countries like India, big democracies such as ours, emergent economies, as in concert with the big powers, to work together to create that equilibrium, that balance, to say yes to multilateralism. We can't say no to multilateralism just because we're a little dissatisfied with how the WHO may have handled the pandemic, especially in the early months, or, how the United States, especially the Trump administration, has been trashing the WHO or other organs of the UN. I don't think that should deter us or take away from faith in multilateralism, because unless you have cooperation between all of us in this time of grave danger to humanity as a whole, I don't think we will be able to get very far.
And I want to come back to India in a moment, because you can disagree on when this might occur, but the march towards being the world's third largest economy, many hope, including me, is unstoppable for India, and therefore its influence on the world stage becoming even more dominant. However, the US and China, you've been ambassador to both countries, you know them exceptionally well. Where do we go from here? We've seen very recently obviously a ramping up of tension between the US and China. Some would argue a blame game, of course. There may or may not be dividends for other countries around the world to loosen China's grip on not only a manufacturing supply chain, but indeed their march towards being the dominant global economy as well. But where do we go from here over the next 2 years? What's your analysis, Nirupama?
Well, I think the first thing for us, of course, is to deal with the pandemic and to be able to develop the vaccine and the treatment so that we put it behind us once and for all. The second thing is to prepare for situations like this for the future. You know, just as ministries of defense everywhere have their contingency plans for times of war, I think what we saw on display in the last few weeks and months was that the world was totally unprepared for situations such as this, despite the fact that analysts and thinkers and experts had been warning for years that we must prepare. I mean, look at what Bill Gates was saying a few years ago about how we need to prepare for pandemics of this nature, and we were totally unprepared. So next time around, I think we will be, the disaster may be of even larger proportions. So we have to prepare for that. The third thing is, I think we must understand that if the world is going this way, where gross inequality is growing by the day and by the year, there will be a lot of discontent around the world. And that will lead to a lot of upsetting of the equilibrium of the world order as we see it today, a lot of instability. And that is where you need leadership. And I think we need to develop that global consensus as a result of the terrible suffering and the difficulties that we've gone through as a result of this pandemic, to be able to see how we can build a more equitable economic order for the world, where there will be less barriers to the transfer of resources and technology so that those in need of it have access to it. And I think we need a more humanitarian, more resilient world order. We've talked of deterrence all these years, about nuclear deterrence, about all the war fighting means and the peace establishing means that we need. But I think today we have to talk of resilience. We have to talk of global resilience. That is really most important. We need humanitarianism. We don't need hegemony.
And I talked about India, of course. There's no doubt that this virus has been hugely damaging to China on the world stage. Those who are investing into the China, not least because people, multinationals, are increasingly alarmed about their reliance on China as a supply chain. India traditionally has been relatively successful in terms of the service sector, but arguably not a manufacturing sector here on the global stage. How do you think India will benefit from this when we all bounce back and a new world order is established?
I think the challenge for India is really to ramp up the proportion of manufacturing in the share of our GDP. Of course, our service sector has grown tremendously, but if we are to create jobs and livelihoods, they will have to be in the manufacturing sector. It's a truism that we've arrived a little late to this realization, because today, as you have the fourth industrial revolution, you have the new technologies that are coming in, we will have to incorporate a lot of that into our strategies in terms of how we create livelihoods and jobs for the millions of our young people who are looking for a better tomorrow. You talked about supply chains, and I think the reliance on China, that has to change. We will have to see how we can create, for instance, India is at the heart of South Asia. We have our South Asian neighbors. We have countries like Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, for instance, the Maldives, Afghanistan. How can we create better integration and connectivity in our region so that the supply chains come out of this region? And that will be a truly integrated future that I think we should all aspire for. We obviously cannot have that just-in-time supply arrangements that the world had got used to since the late 90s, early 2000s. That is going to change. I think we have to come to the realization that the world is going to change irrevocably as a result of what we've seen in COVID-19. But this change was already in the offing for almost a decade before COVID-19 hit us. But this time, I hope the age of enlightenment has come upon us.
Okay, well, listen, in our remaining 5 or 6 minutes, I want to ask you a few questions from our audience, and then I want to wrap up with finding out what you're up to now as well, because that's, I think the audience will find that very interesting. This first question is from Kamalesh Mehta. And he's worried about the South China Sea in particular as another flashpoint. Do you think that may be a potential area for conflict between China and the USA? And what, if any, is the role of India in such a situation?
Well, I think the Chinese and the rise of China as a world power has also meant a dialing up of China's territorial ambitions and the line it has taken on the pursuit of these objectives. So you already have had a scenario in the making there for the last 5 to 6 years, the way China has gone about in the pursuit of these objectives. Now, in a post-COVID-19 world where most people see a diminution of US leadership, particularly in the Asia Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, as we call it, uh, well, China is going to occupy that vacuum. I think the challenge for countries, especially democracies such as ours, and I say India, Japan, Australia, uh, the United States, I would add even countries like Vietnam, because Southeast Asia is so much a part of our neighborhood too. We have to work together to be able to create that balance, that kind of um, not only that equidistancing between China and the United States so that conflict is averted, but also so that we create a scheme, a kind of an order, a kind of a balance, a proportionate order that is able to prevent conflict, to ensure that there are rules in place that prevent that kind of confrontation, that encourage dialogue. I'm not saying that we've been able to achieve much so far, but I hope that the lessons that we have learned from the last few weeks, this kind of lack of any order that we have seen around us in the in the recent past, will change. And I hope, as I said, we learn our lessons from that. But to
Okay.
answer Kamlesh's question, yes, there's a very real chance of tensions increasing in the region. I think somehow we should be able to create that situation where China is able to understand that it has to be able, if it is to be a responsible member of the global order, that it has to understand the virtue of diplomacy and dialogue and peaceful resolution of problems.
Thank you for that. One or two more very quick fire conversations. So sadly, we're running out of time. This one from Nirvana Chowdhury, who's up in Kathmandu. Amazing to see your wide experience in the Foreign Service. Well aware that Nepal and India obviously share an amazing bond, growing meddling in politics from other countries. Would you be able to express your views on this and how it will affect border issues and trade between the two countries, India and Nepal? Just, you're probably not going to do this justice in 30 seconds before I bounce on to another question.
Well, I think the ties that bind India and its neighbors, our South Asian neighbors, uh, I will leave out Pakistan, but I look at all the other neighboring countries. I think the gravitational, pull towards India and also India towards our neighbors, uh, they are so strong. I'm not just talking of religion or culture or ethnicity or language, but it's also the economics of it. It makes sense for our neighbors and India for us to work together, to promote connectivity, to work towards a common market in the eventual future, to be able to share in the fruits of our development, to set aside, the legacies or the suspicions that may have, complicated our relations in the past, and to understand that the true logic of our common benefit and our common future lies in that kind of cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Ravi, I think here in Bangalore. Your views on a permanent seat in the United Nations for India, particularly post-COVID-19?
Well, so far it's been a kind of a bridge too far. We're of course, everybody's agreed that the world order as established post 1945 is completely anachronistic. We need to change the order of things. And countries like India deserve to be permanent members of the Security Council. But, the P5, the people who are there in that very select cohort who are permanent members, have really not worked towards expanding the membership. There's been a lack of intensity, a lack of sincerity perhaps, and a lack of resolve as far as changing the order of things is concerned. So, but there are many opportunities for India to have its voice heard in the world. And today, as we become the third largest world economy, we are positioned for a position of greatness and greater power and influence in the world. And we should take strength from that. I'm sure India's time has come, and we will see more of India's influence being parlayed in the world in the future.
Okay, and very briefly, we've got another question from Dr. Chris Nonis, who I'm sure you know anyway, who's down in Colombo and was the Sri Lankan High Commissioner to the UK. I'd like to ask her to see how the Sino-Indian relationship historically in comparison to it today. How has it changed? You obviously have been involved with that country for many years. But what is the trajectory of that?
I think we've held the peace in this relationship despite all the ups and downs in the last 2 to 3 decades. And I think there are lessons to be learned from that. And that is a good example of how relations between neighbors with a complicated past in the relationship should be handled. Having said that, of course, the rise of China and the assertiveness of China, the muscularity of Chinese foreign policy as we see it today, are forces that we have to increasingly contend with, not only in our region, but also in the bilateral relationship between the two countries. Also, when it comes to trade and economic competition and China's role in South Asia, the China-Pakistan relationship. So today, well into the 21st century, I would say the relationship founded on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence so many years ago, has become so much more complex, so much more challenging for any diplomat who handles it. So if I'm to look into the future, I would say this is going to be it'll continue to be one of the most vital, one of the most crucial relationships that we have with any country. And we will have to create a modus vivendi in this relationship that ensures that while we recognize that there's going to be competition, that we're also able to manage that competition better, that we keep the door to dialogue always open, and that we handle it like a grown-up country, each of us as grown-ups, with maturity and with a sense of balance.
Okay, and last question here on a personal note here from Dr. K. Viswanathan from Chennai. Do you think the work of a foreign secretary becomes more difficult or more easy if the foreign minister happens to be an ex-foreign secretary? So I think there are plenty of parallels in other careers and industries as well, but what are your views on that?
Well, it certainly is a situation that is more exceptional than the rule, but if the foreign minister and the foreign secretary are able to establish a good working relationship, and there is a good trust quotient between them, then I think the Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry benefits from that. And I think both sides should work towards that.
Very good. And Nirupama, just to finish off, for goodness sake, after one of your careers where you've had a family, of course, and you've spent so much time overseas and here, very high profile postings, what on earth do you do next? Bring us up to speed on what you're doing at the moment. I know you've got fingers in quite a few pies, but yeah, tell us.
I'm actually finishing my book on relations between India and China. So that is occupying a lot of my time in the lockdown. I also tried to do a little work in the field of music, especially using music as an integrator in the region of South Asia. We've created a South Asian symphony orchestra that uses music as an enabler in order to get young people in our region to get to know each other better, particularly musicians. Music speaks a universal language, it breaks down barriers, and it facilitates dialogue. So really, I spend a lot of my time writing and also doing this work of using music to bring people together and to reach across borders.
Very good. Well, we look forward to the book when it comes out, and we will also let those people know who've joined us today a link so that they can access that as well. Nirupama, it's been absolutely fascinating chatting to you. I'm sorry that time is against us, but I'd also like to thank all of our audience who have joined us as well. For further information, please either email us at insights@truebeacon.com or go to our website, www.truebeacon.com. And on behalf of not only myself, but also the two founding brothers of not only Zeroda, but of True Beacon, Nikhil and Nitin Kamath, we'd like to thank you, Nirupama, for not only the time that you've spent with us, but also I'm sure all of us would salute your public duty, your service, and the integrity that you've brought to everything that you've done on the world stage. So I look forward to when the lockdown is slightly relaxed and we can meet, even though we are a couple of miles apart. But on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.